Yellow and Red Makes by Digits 27, Chapter 8. Uh, 5 more minutes, Tayuya-chan. The floor just felt so comfortable right now that. What the fuck did you just call me? Naruto was up in a flash, avoiding the very angry fist belonging to his traveling companion that was squarely aimed at his gut. He stood there a moment, roughly 5 feet away from her, as they both just stared at one another in awkward silence. Naruto assumed his famous position with his hand rubbing the back of his head so hard that he might have drawn blood. Sorry about that, Tayuya. Wasn't thinking straight. He smiled sheepishly, and Tayuya just grunted and turned away in a huff. Naruto noticed for the first time that there was food roasting over a small fire that Tayuya had set up. He smiled, drooling slightly from the smell, and went to sit down. Tayuya continued to ignore him as they ate, but he could clearly see that as time passed, her posture relaxed and she started to glance at him. This is really good, Tayuya. She immediately turned away from him, and he thought it was because she was still mad. But what he didn't see was the slight pink tint that had managed to invade her cheeks. Once again, their small campsite was invaded by awkward, unsettling silence that created a tension so thick Nato actually tried to cut it with a kunai. Tayuya turned and saw the strange action, her eyes narrowing. What the fuck are you doing, shithead? Caught, caught red-handed, Naruto smiled peevishly again and quickly hid the kunai in his pack. Nothing, just practicing. Tia dropped her shoulders slightly. She was really going to have to teach him how to lie someday. Even she knew Shinobi had to be an effective liar sometimes. Tia sighed and stood up. It was late into their day, but she figured they could still get some training in. She made a move to go off to one side of the clearing, but Naruto stopped her. Wait, Tayuya, I think we should take a break from training today. We can make it to the border by morning if we just walk from here. What he left out was that it was QB's suggestion. Tayuya just shrugged. If she had gone along with his suggestion up until now, then this was hardly different. They both packed up and carefully hid the fire they had made before falling into step with one another. They continued along for a while. Both were either content not to talk or not risking the consequences if they did. Tayuya had slowly gotten used to the dark of the forest in her short time with Naruto and was stumbling or slipping much less than usual. Even so, Naruto was constantly aware of her position, making sure she was in fact following him and wasn't getting herself hurt. More than a few times she had found herself tripping over a root, about to greet the floor with her face, only to be caught in a surprisingly gentle embrace. Naruto never even wanted to thank you. Never wanted to thank you. He simply did it because he didn't want to see anyone hurt. In their time together, he finally realized there was an especially in front of that when it applied to Tayuya. Being the energetic girl that she was, Tayuya quickly became bored with the never-ending silence, and there was nothing to actually see in the forest. In fact, the only thing that she could do was listen out for the various animal calls that pervaded the dense trees. Hey, shithead! Naruto didn't turn from where he was looking and carried on walking, carefully navigating past shrubs and loose roots. Yeah, Tayuya grumbled slightly over his lack of attention. Well, what happened back there? She flinched inwardly and cursed herself for stuttering again. It was becoming something she despised, but found she occasionally couldn't help around Naruto. For his part, Naruto simply froze for a moment before continuing on at a slower pace, something Tayuya had difficulty noticing. However, she did notice the slightly hesitant tone of his voice when he answered. What do you mean? Tia narrowed her eyes, something that didn't make walking any easier in the near pitch black. I mean, with those two fucktards back there. One second they were beating the crap out of you and carrying me off. The next thing I know is there was some kind of wild animal growling and I'm unconscious. This time Naruto stopped entirely and Taiya nearly walked straight into his back, only managing to swerve around him and trip from her awkward footing. Once again, she was immediately in Naruto's arm, being slowly lowered on to the floor, where he sat down next to her with his legs crossed. Naruto looked contemplatively for a while. He had no idea how to even begin to explain all of this to her, or even if he wanted to. Despite all of their time together, Naruto knew barely anything about his companion. She never opened up and never talked about herself. He sighed slightly. It was probably a reciprocal thing. He too hadn't talked about his past in the slightest, so maybe one of them simply needed to go first. What do you know about the nine-tailed fox? Tayo's face was hidden by darkness, but with his eyesight, Naruto could clearly see the confusion on her face. What the fuck's a fox got to do with this? Is that what attacked those guys? Naruto chuckled slightly. Sort of, but no. Tayuya was getting irritated with all the riddles and half answers, and Naruto could see that. The nine-tailed fox was a demon. He heard a very loud coughing in his head that sounded just as irate as Tayuya's looked. Sorry, he was at the blank. He actually didn't fully understand what Kyubi was himself. We were once known as Biju. Naruto was surprised at the melancholy in Kyubi's words. It wasn't the tone she used at all. A Biju. Again, there was confusion written across his features. I don't really understand it myself, but from what I know, the nine-tailed fox was the most powerful of them. While her curiosity was slowly being stated, she still felt as though Naruto was avoiding her initial question. However, he didn't give her a chance to interject. 7 years ago, the fourth Hokage, he was concentrating on what he said and missed the slight flinch that the Yuya let out after hearing the name. Sealed the nine-tailed into a boy to contain its power. Recovering from her shock at hearing the fourth Hokage, Tayuya returned to her default scowl. She was thinking about what about this fairy tale had to do with anything. Of course, it only took a few moments for her mind to start putting the pieces together. The animalistic growling she had heard, Naruto's age, the supposed power of this nine-tailed fox. Her head suddenly shot up in shock, straight staring straight at Naruto, whose eyes were firmly fixed on the ground, unwilling to meet her gaze. Yeah, I'm the kid that it got sealed into. I'm the container of the QB no Yoko. Tayuya stared for a while, searching Naruto's eyes for any sign of deceit. It didn't take long. He was a terrible liar, and Tayuya could tell that he was telling the truth, or at least he believed he did. She sighed. That meant she was either traveling with some kind of lunatic or a container for an unearthly powerful demon spirit. Perfect. At least it explained why she wasn't currently on her way to either a slave camp or to be some whore for some potential buyer. So you saved me? Naruto's head shot up so fast he thought he had gotten whiplash. He hadn't been expecting that reaction. He had thought you would run away or shout things at him, maybe even try to kill him like the rest of his village had. Yeah, suddenly Taya did something he never thought he would ever see her do, never mind actually experiencing for himself. She shot forward and wrapped her arms around Naruto's shoulder and held him there while he stayed rigid. It was partly out of shock, partly because he had never been on the receiving end of a hug before, and partly because he was afraid of what Takuya might do if he moved at all. Finally, she released him and sat back, the darkness of the forest luckily hiding her blush from Naruto's eyes, not that he would have noticed in his state of surprise. Thank you. She wasn't naive like most 7-year-olds. She knew exactly what happened to those taken away by slavers. It wasn't like the watered down stories parents told their children to keep them in line. You were either forced into backbreaking labor until the day you dropped to the dust, or you were used as some pervert's sick pleasure toy until he lost interest with you. And even that explanation was still a little watered down. She shuddered at the thought. A hug was the least she could do to thank the boy who had saved her from either of those two fates. Naruto, for his part, was speechless. He hadn't even thought about it when he went to save Takuya. It had just seemed instinctual. Now she was thanking him, actually thanking him. He had never been thanked before. Nobody had even been no one had ever been grateful for anything he had done before. His hands moved on its own up to the back of his head, where he nervously rubbed like he was trying to polish his scalp to the bone. It was nothing. Takuya looked at him sternly before scooting closer to him until she was right next to him. He leaned in for another hug, wrapping her hands around him and resting her head against his shoulder. No, it wasn't. You saved me. Naruto was still at a loss for words, but now that Takuya had thanked him, her curiosity had gotten the better of her. But just because you have this thing inside of you, Naruto heard an irritated huff inside his head. How does that mean you could beat those guys? Naruto looked up at the stars that filtered through the leaves for a moment, then back at the girl on his shoulder. She gave me some of her chakra. Takuya sat up a little straighter. She? Naruto spent the next half an hour explaining how he had first met the creature living inside of him, all about his mindscape and what QB taught him. He left out anything about his village or the way he had been treated, but if Takuya noticed she didn't pry, she still had her own secrets to keep. She seemed most interested in the power that Naruto had used to save her, but when she asked him to show her, he explained about why it was dangerous. Again, she didn't show it, but her respect for Naruto went up after hearing that. When he was finished, he sat back, awaiting Takuya's judgment. something he found rather nerve-wracking. So wait, you've been getting extra fucking lessons this whole time? Naruto felt a large drop of sweat develop on the side of his head that just seemed to hang there as he stared awkwardly at her. What? He shook his head, smiling. She was still Tayuya after all. Yeah, but they're in my head, so I'm not really sure what I can do. Tayuya just looked disgruntled that her companion got extra knowledge than her, but QB says that when we get to Suna, we can get a proper teacher who can give us jutsu and stuff. His enthusiasm was irrepressible, and Tayuya immediately found her spirits brightening a little, even if her usual semi-scowl was back in place. Well, then come on, we might as well get going. Naruto nodded cheerfully, feeling as though a massive weight had lifted off of his shoulders and stomach. He almost felt as though he could breathe more easily. Of course, many hours later, when the forest dropped away and the vision was replaced with nothing but sand, and more sand, that weight returned tenfold. Tokyo was equally shocked. The slightly happy attitude she had developed over the last day of talking vanished as she gawked at the intimidating desert that stretched out before them. We're supposed to spend a fucking week in that. Naruto was equally incredulous, although QB was staying suspiciously quiet to his questioning. I guess so, but it's nearly sunrise, so we should probably get some sleep now. Takia didn't move. She just stood there with wide eyes staring out at the impossible scenery. Well, how the fuck are we going to survive out there, you shithead? We can't carry a week's worth of water. Naruto rubbed the back of his head nervously, more concerned with how they were going to get food. Furthermore, QB chose this moment to finally start answering his questions. Oh, okay. QB says that I should be able to smell out oases, and there will be desert animals around there that we can eat. Tahiya narrowed her eyes at him suspiciously. Did QB also tell you how we aren't going to freeze to death? Naruto heard an irritating growl, obviously aimed at Tahiya for the mocking way she said her name. Yeah, apparently we're supposed to wear a load of our clothes all at once. Tayuya was about to retort that the idea sounded stupid in her own special way, of course, but she stopped dead. It actually sounded like a decent plan. She just didn't want to admit it. She merely grunted as a response and went about setting up their camp. She wasn't sure why she was annoyed right now, but she didn't really care. She just wanted to get across the desert and be done with it. Her mood thankfully eased by the time the two of them were snuggling together for warmth. The fact it had gotten a lot colder, and the closer they got to the border, wasn't missing by either child. She drifted off to sleep while Naruto had his first lesson on desert survival. Yubi assured him many times that he was going to need it, not just now, but for a long time if he planned on staying in Suna. It was the middle of their week-long trek across the Wind Country's desert, and the patience of both children was wearing thin. Toyo had been perpetually annoyed ever since Naruto had seen her shivering one night and had offered her his warm jacket. She had refused, of course. No matter who it was, she wasn't willing to look weak in front of anybody. Of course, Naruto merely kept his arm extended as they walked, not making a move to return the jacket to his shoulders. Toyo had grumbled a lot before accepting the jacket. If he wasn't going to use it, then she might as well have. Luckily, she missed Naruto's smirk. She didn't realize it, but he was beginning to understand how she thought a lot more clearly now. Of course, she had immediately felt better after putting the jacket on, but Naruto had come to expect no gratitude from anything less than saving the girl's life. Not that he minded, of course. He was simply glad for the company. He felt as though he had found a true friend in Tayuya. Her no nonsense attitude meant that she could just take him for who he was. She also wouldn't admit it, but he could see that she had gone through some serious hardships in her life. It meant that she could at least understand him. He almost thought about asking her about it after telling her about himself, but he thought against it, deciding that she could open up to him in her own time without him pressuring her. Currently, they were hunkered in a small cave, waiting for a sandstorm to pass. They had learned in the first few days that the phenomena came fast and without warning. Luckily, they only lasted for an hour or so before clearing up. It was the lack of moisture in the air and the constant chill that gave the two worry. Days were spent sleeping under the rock or in any shelter they could find to keep the scorching sun off of them. Nights were spent walking, usually in silence. They moved from oasis to oasis, eating and drinking what sparse supplies they could find. Thankfully, Kyubi proved correct and Naruto could sniff them out, although sometimes it would send them quite a distance off their path. Naruto never was sure how Kyubi could possibly know where she was going when everything just seemed to stretch out in a uniform blend of sand and sky. When he asked, she just shrugged, telling him it was something he wouldn't understand. Answers like that always served to irritate him, much to QB's amusement, he found. Another pastime of the old vixen was serving to make any space the two children shared awkward. Even if Naruto didn't understand most of the words or euphemisms she used, he got the gist of what she was implying. It didn't help that the two would end up wrapped in each other's arms when the temperature dropped before they went to sleep. That was most annoying. What was most annoying was that Naruto had no way of blocking off their mental link to one another, so her laughter couldn't be silenced. How long do you think this bullshit sandstorm's going to last? Taya shook him off out of his thoughts, and he looked up, maybe a bit too hastily as he managed to bang his head on the low roof. He roughed the spot where the rock had struck and winced painfully while Taya stifled a laugh. I don't know. Maybe another 30 minutes. Who can tell with these things? What I'd give just for some rain. It never rained out here. It seemed even the word rain was lacking from the desert's vocabulary. There was only water in the oasis because of underground streams that were somehow protected from the harsh sun. Oh please, this this is shit all compared to the fucking rock hail back in Iwa. Taya immediately clasped her hand over her mouth. She hadn't meant to let that slip. Nato immediately took notice of the strange behavior until he realized Taya had just spoken about herself. She had just accidentally let him know something about her past without meaning to. It didn't really help him though. While he knew where Earth Country was, he didn't know anything about it. You're from Earth Country? She stared at him harshly. Yeah, so what? Big fucking deal. Naruto just shrugged, his eyes genuinely innocent, and Tayuya found that her rocky outer shell was more difficult to maintain than usual. Her shoulders slumped when she actually thought about it. She had to admit it felt good to actually talk about her past, even if it was just that shred of information. What was it like? She looked up at him and nearly glanced at the puppy-like curiosity on her face. Dry. Naito smiled a broad grin. He had just asked a question about Tayuya's past, and she had answered, probably truthfully. It was like a small breakthrough, and he couldn't help but feel a little proud. That dam he had envisioned earlier had managed to gain a few new cracks. Drier than this. What about where you lived? Taya wasn't speaking, but somehow she managed to go even quieter. The small cave becoming deathly silent. Naruto immediately sensed the hesitation over the question and decided that he was asking too much without giving anything in return. I never knew what to think when I imagined the Leaf Village. Taya finally started breathing again as she looked questioningly at Naruto. It was pretty a lot of the time. At night you could see the stars, but at the edge of the sky always had this orange tint. None of the houses ever looked the same, and there was so much variety in every street. It was like you were walking into a whole different country. From the Hokage monument, it would stretch on for what I used to think was forever. He smiled as he thought of those good memories from his time there. It had become so quiet after he stopped talking that even Tayuya's meek voice had no difficulty reaching Naruto's ears. In the winter, we would always get snow. It would cover everything and make it seem really clean and fresh. Then, when it melted, the ground would go a funny shade of red, and the other children used to paint themselves with it like we would see the soldiers in the pictures do. Naruto's smile was softer now. He could tell that it had been incredibly difficult for Tayuya to tell him even that small snippet of information. It would be pressing his luck to ask any more. I think the storm's letting up. We should get ready to move on. Tayuya just nodded slowly, her mind obviously elsewhere, but she mechanically went through the procedure of packing up the gear. Naruto was happy inside. Perhaps now he could finally start to learn more about her. Not even half an hour later, another sandstorm passed over them. Unfortunately, they couldn't find another cave in time. They were forced to walk through it, which was made all the more difficult by the fact that it completely threw off Naruto's sense of smell, leaving them to rely solely on QB's directions. Visibility was so low that they had to hold hands just so they couldn't lose one another. Naruto's heightened senses meant absolutely nothing in this kind of weather. Finally, they crawled into a cave, tired out and partially blinded from all that sand. Naruto might have regretted his earlier fascination with sand if it weren't for his natural determination. Tayuya, on the other hand, was much more willing to berate him for it. Fucking Tsunagakure, it had to be motherfucking Tsunagak. You couldn't have chosen Kumo, could you? No, it had to be the one with all the goddamn motherfucking pieces of shitty ass sand. As she was saying this, she was pouring the surprising amount of said sand out of her sandals, something Naruto figured would probably be a good idea for him as well. Well, it's nearly sunrise anyway, so we might as well have have found shelter. Taiyo merely shot him a deathly glare, and Naruto quickly quieted down. She was in one of her moods, and nothing Naruto said right now was going to help him. Unfortunately, neither of them were even remotely tired yet. Despite all the walking they had done, the chill of the desert night permeated even the rocks surrounding them, forcing them to huddle together. A fire was impractical, as they would only end up killing themselves from the smoke. Not that they actually had any wood for them to burn. The only tree they had actually come across in the entire time was out in the desert, where a few scarce palms. They couldn't even sit in place. The sandstorm outside was causing a dull roar that echoed around the tiny cave, grating on their nerves to the point that they couldn't even hear themselves think. Don't you fucking dare go into your mindscape, shithead. You're not leaving me alone in here with this crappy noise. Naruto smiled sheepishly and would have rubbed the back of his head if his hand wasn't otherwise occupied with hugging Tayuya for warmth. He was actually planning to escape and talk with Kyubi for a bit, and Tayuya had nearly caught him in the act. What do you want to talk about then? Immediately, Tayuya became defensive, narrowing her eyes at Naruto. Who says I want to talk? I just don't like being alone. I just don't like being left alone. Immediately, she turned away and scowled. She hadn't meant to sound like that, as if she needed Naruto. It was besides that point that right now she did in fact need his warmth. It was almost unnatural how warm Naruto could manage to become despite everything that should say otherwise. He was better than a blanket most nights. One more thing Tayuya would be loath to admit. Naruto just shrugged, an impressive action considering his arms were otherwise engaged, and Tayuya for her part sighed. When you talk about your village, you seem to be happy. So why'd you leave? She could feel Naruto stiffen in her arms, something that made their position markedly more uncomfortable. Also, you only talked about the place. What about the people? Naruto relaxed a little, but not to how he was before. Strangely, Tayuya also noted that he had become colder, as if his emotions were tied in with his body heat. There was old man Hokage. He would come around every month to check on me, and we would talk for a while. Nothing specific. We would talk about food or how my studies were going. Taya noticed that he had completely avoided her first question and was too busy considering this that his counter question came as a complete surprise. What about you? Was there anybody special in Earth Country? Taya paled a little, and Naruto could already see her unwillingness to answer. However, he had told her something, and now she felt like she owed him something in return. I had my grandfather. He wasn't much, and he would ignore me half the time, but we had a few good memories. Her face fell, and she mumbled something Naruto wasn't supposed to hear, but couldn't help anyway. When he was sober. What about your parents? Tayuya's face shot around so fast that Naruto thought it might twist off, and there was fire in her eyes, and her glare was hard as ice. What about yours, asshole? All the anger bled out of her features when she saw the emptiness and sadness in Naruto's eyes, unbidden and unshielded, unlike normal. I don't know. I never met them. The old man told me they died after I was born, but he never told me anything else about them. Taiya blinked a few times. You're an orphan? Naruto nodded sadly. Taiya was having difficulty believing him. He acted so cheerful and impossibly happy, yet everything he told her about himself only made his life sound worse and worse. Me too. Naruto's head rose slowly, and she saw something in his eyes understandingly. It gave her a little strength to keep speaking, something she never thought she would do when it came to this topic. They died when I was young as well. I don't even remember their faces. I was never told how or why they died, but it had something to do with the last war. Naruto didn't even realize he was doing it, but he found himself hugging Tayuya a little tighter. Once again, the sandstorm outside began to die down, but Naruto didn't say anything while Tayuya seemed too distracted to even notice. So what about your grandfather? He thought Tayuya was going to round on him again, but instead she just lifted her head wearily, her eyes dulled and tired. Someone once told me he was a great man, a powerful ninja that was feared during the Second Shinobi War. Her head dropped again. But he hated me, said I reminded him of the daughter he lost. He drank all of the time, and when he drank, he would get angry. She left the sentence hanging, but Naruto could see where it was heading. I had no friends to turn to. Their parents told them to stay away from me because of something my grandfather did during the war. Naruto could understand this. There was nobody in his age group that he could talk to, nobody who would come up to him and try and befriend him anymore. Those that did were punished. Those that didn't would whisper behind his back, spread rumors of the monster of the leaf. Children would sometimes run away from him out of fear. Others would actually try to hurt him to appear brave. It was all the same to Naruto: the loneliness, the pain, and sadness. Everybody in my village hated me. The adults would beat me or ignore me, and the children would whisper and throw stones in my direction. People would come and try to burn down my apartment and scratch things into the wall. They all believed I was the so-called demon that was sealed inside of me. I had no friends except for the Hokage. The orphanage even kicked me out when I was 4, said I disrupted the other children. This time it was Taiyo who found herself suspiciously hugging Naruto in closer. How do you do it? How do you stay so happy? Naruto's shoulders slumped. I wasn't. I was never happy in that village. The day before I left, I was about to kill myself. The year involuntary gasped. It was quiet, but still noticeable. It was the QB that saved me. We talked for a while, and she convinced me to leave, to find somewhere I can live happily, somewhere I can find friends. He looked up and smiled at Taiyo, a genuine smile that seemed to warm the cave slightly. And I met you, my first real friend. Again, Tagia gasped, but this time managed to keep it in her head. The fact that he considered her a friend, despite how she treated him, despite how she talked and acted, she didn't know whether to be happy or smack him for being so soft. She decided on both. Naruto was still rubbing his cheek 30 minutes after they had left the cave, and Tagiyo was still internally smiling. They had both lapsed into a pleasant silence, content with their own thoughts for the time being, at least until Naruto noticed something off in the distance. Hey, Tagiya, I see something. Tagiya just groaned. He would do this all the time, announcing every little thing he saw, from strange birds to single trees that jutted out of the sand like the solitary bones of some great creature. Unless it's Suna or a freaking Dongo stand, I don't give a shit. Naruto peered harder through the darkness, trying to see what it was. A bit further on, he had a better picture and was now grinning from ear to ear. Well, it isn't Dongo. End of chapter 8.